I was 59 years old the spring my husband Albin got sick, and married to him for 26 years by then. Long enough that I'd stopped counting except on our anniversary. Albin Hale built Hale Furniture Company out of a one-room shop on Haywood Road with his own two hands. Back before I knew him. Back before the shop grew into the building on the edge of Biltmore Village with his name painted gold on the window. He still went in every morning even after he handed the daily running of it to his sons. He said a man ought to know the smell of his own sawdust until the day he couldn't stand up in it anymore. He kept his grandfather's pocket watch in the top drawer of his desk at the shop, not on his person, because he said a working man loses things that hang loose. It was a Hamilton Railroad watch, the case worn thin and smooth at the edges from 3 generations of thumbs. Every evening he wound it 4 full turns, no more no less. I used to tease him about it. He used to tell me some things are worth doing exactly the same way every single time. I was the archivist at the Buncombe County Historical Archive, which meant I spent my days making sure old deeds and church records and photographs didn't disappear the way most things eventually do. Albin used to say we were a matched pair. He kept sawdust in order. I kept paper in order. The pivot came on a Tuesday in March, in a windowless room at Mission Hospital, when a doctor named Aaron Petrov used the word pancreatic, and then didn't say much else worth remembering. Albin was 64. I sat in the chair beside his bed that afternoon, and watched him fold his hands the way he did before a hard conversation at the shop, the same steady fold he used on difficult customers and on me. Well, he said. That's that then. What I found out over the next 4 months took me a long time to understand, because at first it looked like nothing at all. Perius was Albin's eldest, 43 that year, a corporate attorney in Charlotte who came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and called on Sundays out of what I always assumed was habit. He had his father's square jaw and none of his patience. Zoltan was 3 years behind him, a real estate consultant in Nashville who talked about deals that never quite closed. Married to a woman named Melanthia Cole, who wore her wedding ring like it had cost her something to earn it. The first small wrong thing happened 2 weeks after the diagnosis. Perius called and asked, almost as an afterthought at the end of a long conversation about Albin's treatment plan, whether Dad had ever updated the paperwork on the shop. I told him I didn't know what he meant by paperwork. He said never mind, it wasn't important, and I believed him because why wouldn't I? The second thing was smaller still. Zoltan started coming to Asheville more often that spring, staying 2 or 3 nights at a time, always with some reason. He'd sit with his father in the evenings and ask him questions about the business that Albin had never once asked me to leave the room for. And I told myself it was good, that a dying man should get to talk shop with his son. I did what I was raised to do. I kept it in the family. I didn't ask questions I didn't want the answers to. There was one afternoon that spring I still think about. Perius drove up unannounced, sat with his father for 3 hours without once mentioning the business, and when he left he hugged me at the door and said, "Thank you for taking care of him." He meant it. I could tell he meant it, the same way I could tell months later that it hadn't mattered. By June, Albin was too tired most days to go into the shop, and the boys started handling more of it without asking either of us. Invoices got signed by Perius instead of Albin. Zoltan started sitting in on supplier calls. It looked, if you didn't look too closely, like 2 grown sons stepping up for their father. I didn't look too closely. I had a husband dying by inches in our bedroom, and I did not have room in me that summer for suspicion. I keep coming back to Albin winding that watch every night, for turns, even in his last strong weeks, like some part of him already knew that time was the one thing he could still measure exactly. I thought I understood what was happening in that house that summer. I understood almost none of it. The next stretch of that summer is the part one still have trouble explaining to people, because it was, in its way, one of the best summers of my marriage. Albin rallied in July. Dr. Petrov called it a plateau, not a recovery, but to us it felt like a gift. He had good color back in his face. He wanted eggs in the morning instead of broth. He asked me to drive him past the shop just to look at it from the car. And when we sat there in the parking lot he reached over and took my hand without saying anything at all. Perius flew up twice that month, once just for a weekend, no business reason attached to it. He and his father sat on the back porch and talked about nothing important, fishing trips from 30 years back. A dog they'd had when Perius was a boy. Zoltan brought Melanthia down from Nashville, and she sat with me in the kitchen shelling butter beans and asked me real questions about the archive, about the deeds I cataloged, about a woman's life that had nothing to do with Albin's illness. I let my guard down that July. I let myself believe the worst of it might already be behind us. There is a feeling you get when you have been braced for so long that the bracing itself starts to feel like the only thing holding you up. And then someone tells you that you can finally stand down. I stood down that summer. I stopped watching the mail so carefully. I stopped noticing which drawers in Albin's desk at the shop were locked and which weren't. Albin seemed lighter too, and looking back I understand now that it wasn't the plateau doing that. It was something else. He'd already begun making calls I didn't know about, already begun driving himself downtown some mornings while I thought he was resting, already begun the quiet work of protecting what he'd built. I found out much later that the Hamilton watch went missing from his desk drawer for 11 days that July, and that he never once mentioned it to me. I should have asked why he seemed so at peace with dying. I told myself it was faith, or exhaustion, or acceptance. I never once considered it might be a plan. By the first week of August, the plateau ended the way Dr. Petrov said it eventually would. Albin went back into the hospital on a Thursday, and I understood, sitting in that same windowless room, that the good weeks had been borrowed time and nothing more. I didn't know it then, but that borrowed month was when Albin finished everything. And I wouldn't understand what he'd finished until it was almost too late to matter. What happened 3 weeks after the funeral is the part of this story I've told the fewest times, because saying it out loud still makes my hands go cold. Albin died on a Tuesday in September, quietly, with me holding his left hand and a hospice nurse named Ruth Delacroix checking his pulse with a gentleness I still remember. The funeral was at First Baptist on Charlotte Street, and both boys stood up and spoke, and Perius cried, actually cried, in front of 200 people, and I believed every tear. 3 weeks later, Perius and Zoltan asked me to meet them at Barlow Whitfield's office downtown. Barlow had been Albin's attorney for 19 years, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. And I trusted him the way you trust a piece of furniture that's never once wobbled under you. "Leonora," Barlow said, not quite meeting my eyes as he opened a folder on his desk. "I want to walk you through this carefully." The will he read was dated 14 months earlier. It left the shop building and the business, appraised at just over $900,000, jointly to Perius and Zoltan. It left our house on Kimberly Avenue, for $110,000, to the two of them as well. It left me a life insurance payout of $150,000 and 60 days to vacate the house. I sat very still while Barlow read it. I did not cry. I did not argue. I set my hands flat on my knees and I listened to every word. "There's also the matter of the medical debt," Perius said, once Barlow finished, sliding a second folder across the desk. "The hospice care in the final months wasn't fully covered. $110,000 roughly. Since you were his spouse and made the care decisions, the hospital's looking to you for that. $150,000 coming in. $110,000 going out. $40,000 to start a new life at 59. Dad always wanted the business to stay in the bloodline," Zoltan said, and I watched his face while he said it, the same soft, apologetic face he'd worn shelling beans with his wife in my kitchen not 8 weeks before. Bloodline. 26 years of marriage, and that was the word they landed on. That evening I sat alone in Albin's study, in the leather chair where he used to review invoices, and I opened the top drawer of his desk out of habit, the way I'd done 100 times to find him a pen. The Hamilton watch wasn't there. In its place was a small brass key I had never seen in my life. I turned it over in my palm for a long time before I understood it wasn't a house key or a car key or anything I recognized at all. I didn't tell Perius and Zoltan about the key that night. Some things need to sit before you say them out loud. But I would spend the next 2 days learning exactly what it opened, and nothing about this story would look the same again. I need to tell you about the 2 days between finding that key and understanding what it opened, because I spent most of them convincing myself I was imagining things that weren't there. I searched Albin's study first methodically, the way 20 years of cataloging deeds had trained me to search anything. I went through every drawer, every file box, every book on the shelf behind his desk. Nothing in the house explained a small brass key that fit no lock I could find. It was while I was going through his wallet, still in the manila envelope the hospital had given me with his personal effects, that I found a folded business card tucked behind an old library card he hadn't used in years. First Union Bank, downtown branch. On the back, in his handwriting, a single number. 214. Before I got there, I had a meeting with Barlow scheduled for that Thursday, and I went, because some part of me needed to hear a professional tell me this was really happening. Leonora, I have to advise you against agreeing to anything today, Barlow said, cleaning his glasses for the third time since I'd sat down. His office had a view of Pack Square, the courthouse dome catching the morning light. There are questions worth asking about the timing of this will, about whether it reflects what Albin actually wanted at the end. What kind of questions? I asked. You could contest it. Force a slower process. Give yourself room to negotiate from a stronger position. How long would that take? Months. Possibly a year. And what do I live on during that year, Barlow? The medical debt is due regardless of what I contest. He didn't have a good answer, and I watched him not have one. What if I simply signed everything over? I said. Walked away clean. How fast could that happen? He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't speak. A week, maybe less, if you waive your right to contest. But Leonora, that's irreversible. If something later came to light that would have changed your decision, you'd have no recourse at all. I thought about the key sitting in my purse, warm against the leather like it was trying to tell me something. I understand, I said, and I mostly meant it. My phone buzzed while I sat there. A text from Zoltan. Mother, we don't want this to drag out and hurt everyone more than it already has. Can we finalize by end of week? Mother. He'd started calling me that at the funeral, and it had rung false every time since. They're rushing you, Barlow said, reading my face. That should tell you something on its own. Perius and Zoltan have never been in a hurry about anything in their lives. I almost laughed at that because he was right, and I'd noticed the same thing without letting myself think about what it meant. I don't need more time, I told him. I've already decided. He drew up the release papers that afternoon, muttering the entire time that he was helping me make the worst decision of my life. I let him believe that. I had a bank box downtown with my name on it, and I intended to look inside it before I signed anything at all. First Union's downtown branch had marble floors that were older than the shop, older than me, and a vault manager named Sabina Marsh who led me down with the particular gentleness people reserve for new widows. Your husband was very specific about this box, she said, working the two keys in the panel together. Only the two of you had access. He opened it about 7 months ago. 7 months. Right around when the plateau started. Right around when he began winding that watch with a piece I'd mistaken for acceptance. The box was heavier than I expected. Sabina left me alone in a small viewing room, and I lifted the lid with hands that weren't quite steady. The first thing inside was an envelope with my name on it in Albin's handwriting, marked open only after you've read everything else. I set it aside. Underneath were printed emails. The first was between Perius and someone named Callahan, dated 8 months back. Dad's declining faster than expected. We need to move on the transfer paperwork before he's not competent to sign. Can you draft the restructuring now? The reply, from a man I'd never heard of. Documents are ready. Once he signs, the business moves into the holding company we discussed. The house transfers on death automatically. What about the wife? She won't be a problem. She doesn't touch the business side. By the time she understands, it'll be done. I read it twice. I needed to because the first time through, some part of me refused to believe what it said. Below the emails was a bank statement for an account I'd never heard of, Hale Family Trust, balance $4.1 million. A note in Albin's hand beneath it. Leonora, this is the real money. The boys think everything's tied up in the house and the shop. I moved the bulk of it here months ago. I was trying to protect you. $4.1 million. We had never once, in 26 years, talked like people who had that kind of money. The next folder was labeled Private Investigation, Confidential. Inside were photographs of Perius outside a casino in Cherokee, dated across a dozen separate weekends. A financial summary showing debts of $190,000, mostly gambling related. Some to people who did not send polite collection letters. Zoltan's file was worse in its own way. A string of failed real estate deals funded with money that wasn't his to lose, including retirement savings belonging to 3 elderly clients in Nashville who trusted him with everything they had. The last document was a medical evaluation, dated 3 months before Albin died, from a neurologist I'd never met. Patient exhibits no cognitive impairment. Decision-making capacity fully intact. Underneath it, a second will, dated 6 weeks before his death, leaving everything to me, with a note in the margin. Original held with Ender Callahan, not Barlow Whitfield. There were 2 wills, and the real one hadn't come from Barlow's office at all. My hands were shaking by the time I opened Albin's letter. My dearest Leonora, if you're reading this, I'm gone and the boys have shown you who they really are. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I needed to be certain before I said a word. He explained it in his own patient hand, for turns every night, no more no less. How he'd grown suspicious when Perius and Zoltan suddenly became so attentive that spring. How he'd hired an investigator. How he'd moved the money. How he'd mortgaged the shop and the house both. Deep enough that whatever they inherited would cost them more than it was worth. They think they're inheriting a business and a house. What they're actually inheriting is $800,000 in debt on a shop that isn't worth what they think it's worth anymore. The life insurance they told you about, it isn't $150,000. It's $450. Barlow never should have told you otherwise, and that alone should tell you something about where his loyalties ended up. The final line stayed with me the longest. I know this looks cruel. I couldn't stand by and let them take from you the way they've been taking from everyone else. They made their choices, Leonora. Now they live with them. Call Ender Callahan first. He'll explain the rest. I sat in that windowless room for a long time before I could make myself stand up. Tonight I still had a dinner to get through at Zoltan and Melanthia's house. Still had to sit across from 2 men who'd called me mother at their father's funeral, and smile like I didn't know a single thing I now knew. But tomorrow, I was calling Ender Callahan. And I had a strong feeling that whatever he had to tell me would change everything. Perius and Zoltan believed they'd already won. Zoltan and Melanthia's house sat on 2 acres outside Weaverville, the kind of place that looked expensive from the road, and told you exactly how expensive once you got inside. I noticed things on the drive up I hadn't let myself notice before. A new Lexus in the driveway beside Melanthia's BMW. A landscaping crew's truck pulling out as I arrived. The kind of crew that didn't come cheap. I understood now where some of that money had actually come from. And it wasn't from real estate deals that closed. Melanthia met me at the door in a dress that had never seen a department store rack. Leonora, she said, pulling me into an embrace that barely touched me at all. You look like you're holding up so well. I'm managing, dear, I said. Thank you for having me. Perius was already inside with a scotch that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a month, sitting in Zoltan's study like he owned it, which in a sense he was about to. Mother, he said, standing to hug me. You look better than yesterday. I was worried. Yesterday, when he'd told me I had $40,000 and 60 days. Such touching concern. Dinner was pork tenderloin that Melanthia had clearly worked hard on. Served on china that had probably never touched a dishwasher. The three of them moved around me all evening like gracious hosts, refilling my wine, asking careful questions about my plans. And if I hadn't spent the afternoon in a bank vault reading about their debts, I might almost have believed it. Barlow called me this afternoon. Perius said over the main course. Says you're ready to move forward with signing. I took a slow bite before answering. I've decided fighting isn't how I want to spend whatever years I've got left. Family matters more than money. Relief moved across Zoltan's face so plainly I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. That's really good to hear, he said. Dad would be glad we're all working through this together. I have been thinking about the medical debt though, I said, setting down my fork. $110,000 is a lot to take on a loan. I thought maybe an accountant should look at the estate's liquid assets first, before I agree to anything. The room went quiet in a way that told me everything I needed to know. Perius set his glass down harder than he meant to. What kind of thinking, exactly? Well, I said pleasantly. Your father was always so careful with his records. I'd imagine there's documentation somewhere showing exactly what's estate debt and what's personal. Edwin handles the financial side, Melanthia said too brightly. Don't you, honey? Everything's categorized properly, Zoltan said quickly. The medical bills fall to you as his spouse. I'm sure they do, I said. Although I have been going through his study, and I keep finding things I don't understand. Statements for accounts I never knew existed. A safety deposit box key I'd never once seen in 26 years. Zoltan's fork clattered against his plate. Perius went very still, the same stillness I remembered from the office the day they read me the will. A safety deposit box, Perius said carefully. Isn't that strange? I said. I thought I knew everything about our finances. Apparently your father had accounts I never heard a word about. Mother, Perius said, his voice straining to stay casual. Why don't you bring whatever you found to our next meeting? Let us help you sort through it. Dad's filing system was never logical. That's kind of you, I said. But I think I'd like to understand it myself. I'll be managing on my own from now on after all. Melanthia excused herself for dessert with a little too much urgency. A chocolate torte, from some magazine. And I ate a slice of it while Perius and Zoltan traded a look across the table that they thought I couldn't read. They walked me to my car afterward. Perius held the door, his voice low. About those documents. It'd be best if you brought them to Barlow's office. Let us help you sort out what actually matters. Of course, I said. Family should help family. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I caught him in my mirror, phone already at his ear before I'd made it to the road. Whoever he was calling, it couldn't wait until he got back inside. By the time I got home, my own phone was ringing. A number I didn't know. Mrs. Hale, this is Ender Callahan. I believe you may have found some documents that belong in my office. Mr. Callahan, I said, settling into Albin's chair in the study that was mine now. How did you know I'd found them? Your husband was specific. If you found that box, I was to hear from you within a day. Ma'am, there are things you need to know before you sign one more piece of paper with those two. Ender Callahan's office was nothing like Barlow's. A modest storefront in West Asheville, files stacked in careful towers, the look of a place where the work mattered more than the impression. Callahan himself was in his 60s, soft-spoken, with the hands of a man who'd built his practice one case at a time. Mrs. Hale, he said, rising to meet me. Thank you for coming. There's a great deal to go through. I sat across from him with my purse and Albin's letter, held tight in my lap. I have to admit I'm confused about all of this, Mr. Callahan. I didn't know Albin had hired a second attorney. He hired me about 8 months ago, Callahan said, opening a file thick enough to need both hands. Started as a quiet investigation into some irregularities he'd noticed. It grew from there. He laid out the same documents I'd already read in the vault, plus more I hadn't seen. Forged signatures on loan paperwork, using the shop as collateral for Perius's gambling debts. Wire transfers moving client retirement funds into Zoltan's shell companies. Enough evidence, Callahan said, for grand larceny charges against both of them if I chose to pursue it. He could have had them arrested, Callahan said. He chose something else instead. He pulled out the property records next. The shop, mortgaged to $800,000. The house on Kimberly Avenue, mortgaged to $400,000 more. As of 6 months ago, both properties are leveraged to the edge of what they're worth. Your husband arranged it that way deliberately. So when they inherit, I said slowly, they inherit debt, not equity. Considerably more debt than equity, yes. And the real will, the one your husband finalized 6 weeks before he died, leaves the decision entirely to you, whether they inherit anything at all. He handed me the document. One clause, near the end, in language plain enough that even grief couldn't make me misread it. I leave the disposition of any inheritance to my sons, Perius and Zoltan, entirely to the discretion of my wife, Leonora, trusting her judgment above all others. He gave it to me to decide, I said quietly. He did. And there's more, Mrs. Hale. He documented everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every lie told while he was dying. If you want to pursue charges, there's more than enough to secure convictions. My phone rang before I could answer. Zoltan. Callahan shook his head, so I let it ring out. What happens? I asked. If I don't press charges, but I also don't hand over the properties. They inherit nothing. Just their father's memory and whatever debts they've already dug for themselves. The creditors who've been circling, waiting on that inheritance, won't wait much longer. The phone buzzed again, a text this time. Mother, we need to talk. Come to Barlow's office. Please don't sign anything until we sort this out. I looked at the message a long moment, then set the phone face down on Callahan's desk. Mr. Callahan, I said, standing and smoothing my skirt. I think it's time Perius and Zoltan learned exactly what their father actually left them. 26 years of being managed, patronized, dismissed as the second wife who didn't understand the family business. And in the end, Albin had understood something I hadn't let myself see until that vault. That the quietest person in a room is sometimes the one holding every single card. Barlow's conference room had never felt so small as it did the next morning, with Perius and Zoltan sitting on one side of the mahogany table and Barlow at the head, looking more uncomfortable than I'd seen him in 19 years of knowing him. Leonora. Perius started before I'd even taken my seat. Glad you're here. This whole thing has gotten confusing, and we need to clear some things up. What kind of things? I asked, settling into my chair, hands folded calmly in my lap. Someone's been spreading misinformation, Zoltan said. Claims about a different will, hidden accounts. We're worried people are trying to take advantage of your grief. Barlow cleared his throat. Leonora, I have to say I'm confused myself. Mr. Callahan claims to have documents that supersede the will I've been handling, but Albin never mentioned changing attorneys. That's because he stopped trusting you, I said quietly. The room went still. Barlow's face colored. Perius and Zoltan exchanged a look I'd finally learned to read. Excuse me, Barlow said. I opened my purse and set Albin's letter on the table. He found out someone in your office was passing information about his estate planning straight to his sons. He couldn't be certain if it was you or someone under you. So he took his business elsewhere and didn't tell either of us. That's not possible, Perius said, though his voice had already lost its footing. Dad trusted Barlow completely. Did he? Then why did he hire a private investigator 8 months ago to look into your finances? Why did he move $4.1 million into an account only I can touch? Zoltan made a small, strangled sound. $4 million. Dad didn't have that kind of money. He did, Ender Callahan said, entering behind me and taking the seat beside mine, briefcase already open. He'd been building it quietly for years, specifically to protect Leonora. And the house and the shop, both leveraged to the edge of their value. $800,000 against the shop. 400 against the house. He arranged it so that inheriting them would cost you more than they're worth. You're lying, Perius said, but there was no weight behind it anymore. Callahan laid the folder open. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Photographs of Perius at the casino in Cherokee, dated across a dozen weekends. Records of Zoltan's shell companies and the retirement money that had disappeared into them. Your father documented everything. Every forged signature. Every transfer. Recorded conversations where the two of you discussed how to handle the estate while he was still in the hospital. Melanthia, who had come in behind Zoltan and said nothing until now, finally spoke. This is a misunderstanding. We can work this out. There's nothing to work out, I said. The real will leaves the decision entirely to me. What, if anything, you inherit? I laid a document on the table, the gift deed Callahan had drawn up the day before. Perius read it fast, his face moving through confusion, then understanding, then something closer to fear. You're giving us the properties, Zoltan said slowly. With the mortgages. That's right. You'll own roughly 1.2 million in property with 200,000 more in debt than that's worth. Given what you already owe elsewhere, that seems fitting. You can't do this, Perius said, without conviction. I can. It's exactly what your father wanted. Barlow finally found his voice. Leonora, this is highly irregular. Perhaps we should all take time to. No, I said. I've had all the time I need. They can accept the inheritance as it stands, or they can walk away with nothing. Those are the only two doors. And if we walk away, Zoltan asked. Then Mrs. Hale pursues criminal charges, Callahan said. Grand larceny, Guide fraud, elder financial abuse. The evidence would put you both away for a long time. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I watched Perius's mind work, hunting for an angle that wasn't there. Zoltan just looked hollowed out. What do you want from us? Perius finally said. I want you to sign what's offered. I want you to leave me alone unless it goes through an attorney. And I want you to understand your father chose this for you. Not out of hate. Because you gave him no other option. Melanthia was crying quietly now. We'll lose everything. You should have thought of that before you started stealing from a dying man. I said, and I found I meant every word of it without a shred of satisfaction in saying it. They signed. There wasn't a version of that room where they didn't. As they filed out, Perius paused at the door. This isn't over, Leonora. It is, I said. It's completely over. 3 months later, I sold what remained of the properties Perius and Zoltan couldn't keep. And I moved into a small house outside Black Mountain with a view of the ridgeline that Albin used to say looked like the edge of the whole world. Perius filed for bankruptcy that winter and, from what I heard secondhand, started court-ordered counseling for the gambling. Zoltan moved back into a rental near his mother-in-law's, and Melanthia filed for divorce inside of 6 months. I didn't take any satisfaction in hearing it. I noticed, though, that I didn't grieve it either. Some evenings, when the fog settled low over the ridgeline the way it does in the mountains, I thought about Albin and wondered if he'd have approved of how it all played out. Then I'd think of his letter, his 4 turns of the watch every night, his patience stretched out over months I hadn't understood at the time, and I decided he would have. The house came with a garden gone to seed, and I spent that winter and the following spring bringing it back. I planted roses like the ones we'd grown together on Kimberly Avenue. It was slow, careful work, the kind that asked nothing of me but attention, and after 26 years of managing everyone else's expectations, that felt like its own kind of gift. I started volunteering at the county archive again, part-time, cataloging deeds the way I always had. I joined a garden club. I learned slowly who I was when I wasn't defined by being somebody's wife. One afternoon that spring, a young woman stopped at my gate while I was deadheading roses. Mrs. Hale? I'm Delta Callahan. Ender's my father. He thought you might be interested in something I work on. What kind of something? I asked, setting down my shears. I help women getting out of financial abuse situations. Family money used as a weapon, that sort of thing. Dad said you might understand it better than most. I thought about the woman I'd been in that conference room a year earlier, certain she was powerless, certain $40,000 was all that was left of her life. I might, I said. Tell me more. 2 months after that conversation, I put my name behind the Alban Hale Fund for Financial Justice, offering legal support and financial education to people finding out, the hard way, what their families are actually capable of. It wasn't the legacy Perius and Zoltan expected to leave behind them. It was exactly the one their father intended. Write everything down. That's what Alban used to tell me, back when I thought he only meant it about the archive. I understand now he meant it about everything. The truth always leaves a paper trail, if you're patient enough to wait for it. Here is the thing I wish someone had told me before any of this started. Love does not require you to lay down your own measurements. You are allowed to check. You are allowed to measure twice, even when you want to believe. Especially when you want to believe. Because love that cannot survive a second measurement is not love. It is a loan you were never going to get back. I still keep his watch in my desk drawer. I wind it every evening, for turns no more no less. Not because I need to know the time. Because some things are worth doing exactly the same way, every single time, for as long as you're able.